Last night, around 2 a.m., I got up to put wood on the fire, use the bathroom, go back to bed. I saw that the fire was out, so I said to heck with that. I was half awake, half asleep, didn't want to take the time to rebuild it because I knew I'd wake up by the time I got it going again. So I went into the bathroom, was taking care of my business, finishing up, and I felt someone behind me. So I turned, expecting to see my wife. There was a woman there, but it wasn't my wife. But I did know who this woman was. And she said to me, "I came to tell you goodbye and that I told you so." And like that, she was gone. And like that, I staggered back to bed, went back to sleep, didn't even think any more of it, had completely forgotten about it till this morning. I was up in my office working. The sun had just come up, so I opened the blinds. I looked out the window and I saw beautiful daffodils in bloom, and I remembered the visit from the night before, last night. I Googled this woman's name, and the last location of which I knew of her to be living, I've been out of contact with this woman for a very long time, 15, 20 years maybe. What came up in the Google search was her obituary. She passed away about a week ago. So I just instantly went back in my mind to maybe 1980. I was 7, I was 8, maybe. She was the same age. And I remember walking into church one morning, and there were a bunch of people huddled around this old woman who was crying, and I didn't know what was going on. I was a kid, so I went to the next to the last pew because that's where I hung out with a couple of the other younger kids while we waited through that wrenching 2-hour sermon every Sunday to be finished so we could leave. And there was a little girl there waiting on me, 7 or 8 years old, same age as me, and she had a fistful of daffodils, Easter lilies. And she stuck them out and she said, "Will you marry me?" And I took them. And I said, "I won't marry you, but I'll always be your friend." And I gave them back to her. And we sat down and we started playing with the Matchbox cars that I sneaked into church to pass our time. And we're playing, we're trying not to be too loud. And all of a sudden, this little girl, she looks up and she's staring over at the crowd where there's this old woman, probably 80 years old, crying, and everybody's consoling her. And she's just staring. And so I look over in the direction of her gaze, and I'm like, "What's going on? What are you looking at?" And she says, "Old man Baxter. He just came in, and he sat down, and he's put his arm around his wife, but she's still crying, and nobody's talking to him. It's like he's not even there." So I look over, and I could see old Mrs. Baxter crying, and my folks were there, and everybody was consoling her. And I said, "Well, I don't see him." And she says, "Well, he's there. He's right there with her, and he's got his arm around her, but she's still crying." So I got back to playing with the Matchbox cars, and so did she. The preacher gets up eventually, and he pounds the podium, and he says it's time to start. We start with a prayer. After the prayer, he says, "I've got some bad news. It appears as if last night we lost one of our congregation members." And he says, "Mr. Baxter has gone on to be with the Lord." And I looked over, and again, I could now understand why the old woman was crying. And I was thinking, how could old man Baxter be there, like my friend just said, if he died the night before? So I look over at my friend, and she's just sitting there, her mouth agape, staring over at Mrs. Baxter, who's still crying, still has people around her. And my friend, this little girl, tells me, "He's not dead. He's right there. I see him." I'm getting chills telling the story for more reasons than just one. So the years would pass. We would remain acquaintances at best, I guess. We'd get older and we'd fall into different cliques. I was the jockey type. I was an athlete, pretty good at it. And she was, I guess what back then we would have called maybe the nerdy type. She was book smart, straight A. We ended up going to the same very small state college together. And I never really took note of that until it turned out that we would work together on the staff of the college newspaper. I was a sports editor, She did some other stuff. But we got reacquainted at that time, and that's when I realized she was really easy on the eyes. Brainy nerd type aside and all, she was hot. I mean, there's just no other way to say it. So we started hanging out together, and she would come down to my apartment on occasion, and in my mind, we're up to like circa 1992, 1994, 1995 now. We're in our early 20s. And who among you watching this video can remember Boone's Farm, Strawberry Hill? Right? It's like very cheap. They call it wine, but trust me, if there's any wine connoisseurs out there watching this, you will state emphatically that Boone's Farm is not wine. It was cheap, and we could get it right across the road at the convenience store, and we were college students, and it worked. And Strawberry Hill happened to be her favorite. So I remember she was down at my apartment. It was about this time of year, March, April. Winter was giving way to spring, and it was a nice evening. We had taken our Boone's Farm, Strawberry Hill, out back into the yard behind my apartment. It was warm. We could hear the frogs, like you've heard from my pond down here off and on throughout this video. They'll start back up here in a minute, I'm sure. Right on cue. Well, and I guess, with the combination of the Boone's Farm, Strawberry Hill, and my age and the situation, I noticed there were some daffodils close by, some Easter lilies, so I reached over and plucked a few, and I rolled over, and we were laying on that grass, and I handed them to her, and I said, "Let's pretend we're married." And she took them, and we started kissing, and it was reciprocal. But she caught herself, and she said, "No, let's not." She handed those daffodils back, and she said, "I don't want to pretend like we're married, but I'll always be your friend." I took them back, and I said, well, it's worth a try, and it didn't harm our friendship in any way. We kept drinking our Boone's Farm, Strawberry Hill on that occasion and many others after that, and we continued to write together on the staff student paper there. And there was a publication that came out quarterly back when we were in school, and it featured short fiction written by students, and I would always submit something to that publication, but it would never get published. And I would always tell myself, because the editor of that publication, who was also a student, and the advisor, who was a English lit professor there, who I had her for freshman English whatever 001, the one you have to take. I always said it was because these two people didn't like me. How could that be? Not like me, right? And, after they rejected like my third submission, I even went to the guy, the editor, and I'm like, "Why aren't you guys publishing any of my stuff?" And he said, "Because your stuff sucks." I was a sports editor on our college paper. He said, "You need to stick with sports. You need to stick with nonfiction. A storyteller you are not. Give it up." But my friend, she always got published, and her story was always featured. And though part of me wanted to say that it was because, well, they just like her better than me because she's a nerdy type. She's a straight A student. You know, she's doing everything the right way, the way you're supposed to when you're in college. That wasn't the truth, and I knew it even at the time because I could read her stories, and they were so good, they were so well written that they seemed real. They were fiction, but they seemed like they were nonfiction. And she typically wrote about paranormal, supernatural, people coming back from beyond the grave to maybe give a message to someone that they didn't feel that they had quite had closure with before their passing. I mean, her stuff was good. So after that semester's publication of this collection of short fiction came out and her story was featured and mine was rejected and blah, 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 we were hanging out at my place. We were having some Boone's Farm Strawberry Hill. And I asked her, I said, how do you write like that? You are so good. I said, you seem to be gifted. You seem to have a skill that I want that I obviously don't have. You know, the guy, the editor, he told me, give it up, stop trying. You'll never be a storyteller. You suck. I wish I could do what you can do so well. Help me. What pointers can you give me? And she said, I can be bluntly honest with you. I can tell you exactly how I write my stories in order to where they just seem so believable, but you'll never believe me, and I don't think it's something you'll ever be able to emulate. You'll never be able to do this the way I do it because you can't do what I can do. And I said, well, what is it that you're doing? What is it that you can do that I can't, that I may? She said, you can't even work on it. You've either got this or you don't. And I said, what, talent? And she said, no. A third eye. I said, a third eye, like, you're telling me you can see the future? She's like, no, none of that stuff. She goes, all I can tell you is that I can see things others can't. And she reminded me of that time in church, which would have been like 15 years prior to this at this point. She said, do you remember when we were kids and we were in church and I told you I saw old man Baxter sitting beside old woman Baxter, consoling her while she cried, and then the preacher said he had died the night before? And I said, yeah, I can. And I told her, I just always figured that maybe you and your family had found out that the old man had passed away before, you know, the preacher announced it, and you were playing some kind of trick. And she told me, no, that's not it. She said, I had no clue that he had passed away until the preacher said so, you know, just like when you found out. She said, I saw him sitting there in that pew, putting his arm around his grieving wife, consoling her the morning after he'd passed away. And I said, you're kidding me. And she said, I'm not kidding you. And she said, that was the first time it ever happened, and it's happened since. And I said, well, give me another example of when this happened. And she goes, you know those stories I write that are always featured in that publication you can't even get printed in? And I'm like, yeah, because I know that guy hates me, and I know that old prude that teaches that class hates me. And she says, that might be the case because you're not a very good student. It's like you party, you go to class when there's a test, you get an A, they hate you for it. And that was the truth of it, and they eventually started failing me for excessive absences. It's the only way that they could give me an F. Whatever. I finally graduated, barely, but I got out of there. But she told me, she said, the stories I write are things I've experienced. I just reiterate what I saw or what I felt or what I experienced in story form. She goes, the grammar, the editing, all that just comes natural. It's what I do. She was an English lit major. And I said, there's no way that's even possible. What you just told me is not possible. And she said, I'll prove it to you. I said, how? And she said, well, I'm only going to be able to do this one way. And I said, how's that? And she says, you've got to make sure that you outlive me. I said, you're kidding me. She goes, no, just make sure you outlive me. As long as you outlive me, if I die before you do, I will come back and tell you that I told you so. I was like, okay, number one, this is morbid. Number two, this is crap. There is no way this is real. And she said, wait and see. and don't die.